Madam Speaker, I rise again. And with your leave, and on the section of the order paper that deals with public business, Bill's second reading, I like, of course, to have read in this House for the second time the bill shortly entitled the Consumer Protection Bill 2023, and which would have had its first reading on the 18th of September this year, when we would have, just before independence, 40th anniversary, had brought this bill into being in this House. The Consumer Protection Bill comes before us from the Ministry of International Trade, Industry, Commerce, and Consumer Affairs, because it is very strongly believed that with all that is happening around us in the world, with the changes in prices of goods related, of course, to very many different reasons, there is more and more an urgency for consumers to be protected, and also at the same time encourage those who are in business to work with consumers to ensure that at the end of the day, both sides of the equation would benefit. I emphasize that this bill seeks to provide for the promotion and the protection of consumer interests in relation to the supply of goods and the provision of services, and to ensure that there is appropriate protection of life, of health and safety of consumers. It is to ensure that there is established a Consumer Affairs Department, or maybe I would say a revisiting of the Consumer Affairs Department in the ministry I've just mentioned, and also for other purposes. This bill is bringing into being the consumer protection in another phase in this long history of supporting consumers and their rights and interests all along. I want to emphasize that the bill is replacing the Consumer Affairs Act, Chapter 18.38, which was published as an act, as Act 9, I should say, back in 2003, and which was brought into force in this Assembly on the 8th day of December 2003. In other words, 20 long years ago. The Consumer Affairs Department, in fact, was legally constituted in 2003 through the passage of the Consumer Protection Act of 2003. And this act provided at that time the legal framework that would ultimately guide the officers therein on how to conduct the daily functioning of the department. Additionally, It highlighted the legislative scope of the Department of Consumer Affairs and the way in which the department should be structured in order to function as a quasi-court for consumer protection issues. But, Madam Speaker, over the last 20 years of the existence of this department, many internal deficiencies have been identified as contributing factors that would have hampered the ability of the department in performing its duties effectively and efficiently. Today, we are here in this Parliament to debate the Consumer Protection Bill 2023, which is envisaged to give officers of the Consumer Affairs Department more legislative authority, or as we would commonly say, more teeth in order to accomplish their daily task as consumer protection officers. There was a time when we had price control officers. That's no longer used. The system has been changed as a result of appropriate legislative action. And so when we, from time to time, recognize that prices would have moved on the shelves from one day to the next, or from 1 week to the next, or 1 month to the next, we would commonly say, well, what is happening with these price control officers? Don't they see that the prices are going up every day and they're doing nothing? Price control officers do not exist and would not have existed for quite a while. But instead, as I said, there were put in place consumer protection officers. But we recognized that they could not function at peak and with highest efficiency because there were some legislative lacunae which prevented them from really operating the way that they should. I noticed you like the word lacunae. But the Act will therefore now be replaced by this harmonized bill which is before us today. The enactment of harmonized consumer protection legislation in the sub-region, that is the OECS member states, is very, very important in light of the onset of the CARICOM single market and single economy. In this new environment, the OECS member states are required to move away from exchange controls and price controls and to move towards what we call a liberalized market. Now, this piece of legislation is, as I said, a revision of what would have been the old Act. In fact, Part 2 of Chapter 8, which of course make reference to Articles 184 of the legislation, 184 to 186 of the legislation, of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which would have established the Caribbean community, including the single market and economy. Member states specifically in that piece of document, member states are required to promote and to protect the interests of consumers in the community by appropriate measures. And in Article 185 in particular of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, it provided member states with, or in fact I said it provides that member states shall act in a harmonized legislative framework that is aimed at protecting the consumers of St. Kitts and Nevis, as, of course, the consumers of the rest of the sub-region. And so, Madam Speaker, the CARICOM Secretariat has therefore provided model consumer protection legislation for all of the member states of CARICOM, and the OECS Secretariat has dutifully tailored that model legislation to better meet the needs of the OECS member states within the wider CARICOM region. And this model legislation has been further tailored to meet the specific national policy, the needs of our people here in St. Kitts and Nevis, in this our federation. In this regard, I want to thank the chambers of the Attorney General and the relative legislative attorneys, draft attorneys, who have been working on this piece of legislation for some time. And I'm pleased that we are now in a position, after consultation with the ministry and with the appropriate stakeholders, we are now able to come to Parliament today and ensure that this new piece of legislation is brought into the arsenal of the laws of St. Kitts and Nevis to be better protectors of the people's interest, especially those who are consuming a number of items and are the recipient of certain services. And so the Consumer Protection Bill takes into account Part 2 of Chapter 8 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and in accordance with Article 186, it provides for the following policy objectives, which, if you would allow me, Madam Speaker, I would go through now. What are these policy objectives? 1, the fundamental terms of a contract and the implied obligations of parties to a contract for the supply of goods or services. It is more so now a contractual arrangement between the two parties. Number 2, it also is intended to achieve the objective of the prohibition of the inclusion of unconscionable terms in contracts for the sale and supply of goods or services to our consumers. 3, another objective is the prohibition of unfair trading practices, particularly such practices that relate to misleading or deceptive or fraudulent conduct. 4, the prohibition of production and supply of harmful and defective goods, and for the adoption of measures to prevent the supply or sale of such goods, including measures requiring the removal of defective goods from the marketplace, from the shelves, from wherever the market is. Common complaint that we would have had that consumer protection officers under the old legislation, they visit, they identify goods that they believe, with good reason, are defective. Those goods are ordered off the shelves, but we have to wait until the appropriate officer in a different ministry comes and removes them. By the time they come, they're going back on the shelves, and so the consumer is not protected. That will come to an end. This is to ensure that when defective goods are removed from the market, they are removed. Another important objective, number 5, is the provision of services in compliance with the applicable regulations, with the standards, with the codes, and the licensing requirements. 6, that goods which are supplied to consumers, that they are appropriately labeled in accordance with the standards and specifications prescribed by the competent authorities. We have seen that the date of expiration of goods removed, that will have to come to an end. The objective is to ensure that the consumer is protected by ensuring that the date is there. There are certain chemicals which we understood they have devised that if you apply, it removes the date. That will come to an end when this piece of legislation, the Consumer Protection Act or Bill, is put into effect. Goods supplied to consumers are properly labeled in accordance with the standards and specifications prescribed by the competent authorities. And the objective of this act that we have before us in Parliament today is to ensure that that is maintained. Number 7, another important objective is that hazardous or other goods whose distribution and consumption are regulated by law are sold or supplied in accordance with applicable regulations. If it does not have appropriate markings, if they are not properly dated, if they are not properly described in their distribution, we have to ensure that if the law says that they are supposed to be so marked and identified, that they would have to be. Otherwise, this would be a regulation that is in fact violated, and the law would then take its course. We want to make sure that another objective is attained, and that is that goods or materials, the production or use of which is likely to result in potentially harmful environmental effects, that they are labeled and supplied in accordance with applicable standards and regulations. We want to make sure that goods which can have harmful and environmental effects, that they are so labeled and they are in fact supplied in a particular way according to specifications. This objective, if it is not achieved when consumers are out there doing business, then the law will kick in and we will have some action in the court of law. Another important objective, Madam Speaker, is that producers and suppliers are liable for defects in goods and for violation of product standards and consumer safety standards which occasion loss or damage to consumers. This also is very, very important. If I bought a good particular product from a particular supplier and it caused me to be sick, and I am certain that it came from there, you are liable for violating my health, and you shall pay. This is very, very important for protection of our consumers. Another important objective, Madam Speaker, that we wish to attain by this new piece of legislation is that violations of consumer safety standards by producers or suppliers are appropriately sanctioned, and relevant civil or criminal defenses to such violations are available to defendants. So if there's a poor boy, a poor woman, an elderly, she ain't got no money to go to a lawyer to ensure that her rights as a consumer are protected. This law we will put into place today says that she should be able to be provided with available legal support and defendants of what she thinks would be her right, her claim, I should say, for that right that would have been violated. So, Madam Speaker, permit me now to highlight a few salient features of the bill, apart from the objectives I've just gone through. If it is enacted into law, and I hate to think that the opposition will not support this bill. So if enacted into law, and I can say when enacted into law, this bill will be applicable to all persons involved in trade and commerce, whether through purchasing or supplying of goods or services, and the bill would also be binding on the Crown. Binding on the Crown. That is, government, of course, is bound to be involved in such transactions. The Consumer Protection Board, therefore, will be established, and its specific functions will include the conducting, who's going to help me? May not find the appropriate sections.
Which one?
The board, making reference specific. Right. Functions of the board, section 8. Right. So the Consumer Protection Board will be established according to this piece of legislation, and its functions will include the conducting of investigations on behalf of consumers adversely affected in relation to the sale of goods or provision of services in order to determine whether they were sold or provided in contravention of this act. So that is why I said that one of the important pieces that was missing from the previous bill or law was that it did not act as a quasi-judicial body. This, today, is different. It will act as a judicial body by way of the Consumer Protection Board being properly put in place. What does it say about the board? Let me go through this first. Right. And the board will be established, as I said, and its functions will include the conducting of investigations on behalf of consumers who have been adversely affected in relation to the sale of goods or services which they would have obtained in order to determine whether there was really a violation of the Act and whether a claim by one who would have been violated is established or not. Now, and as a result of this investigation that would have been done, there would be certain specific recommendations that are made to the minister promoting the development of consumer organizations and resolving disagreements between consumers and vendors or service providers. The bill provides, therefore, for the procedure for investigation of complaints by the board or the department responsible for consumer affairs, and the board will be empowered to summon persons. That is why we said at the beginning, it is now a quasi-judicial body. It is empowered to behave as if it is a court. And this empowerment has come from this new piece of legislation. And therefore, it can summon persons to give evidence for the purposes of investigations. If the young man was asked to remove the date or tamper with certain specific guidelines on the product, he can be brought to the court of the board and confirms the accusation, and thus would provide the necessary evidential support for a decision to be taken in order to protect the consumer and at the same time give such strong warning or action against the person who would have provided that particular product. Therefore, here is where, as I said, the Consumer Protection Bill of today, it has teeth. Present consumer officers, they go, they say, this is not right, do this, do that. Fellas, them laugh at them, they don't have no power. Now they have power being brought into this parliament through this piece of legislation that becomes law after it is passed today. And the opposition dare not support it. They must support it today for it to become law. So it provides the procedure for investigation. But it also goes on. The bill imposes obligations on vendors, on service providers, and consumers in relation to goods sold or services provided. For example, a vendor or a provider is under an obligation to provide information as to the origin, the price, the care, where was it stored, what are the conditions of storage, was it stored with rats and dogs and cockroaches. These are important matters that will now come to play as we try to protect our consumers and ensure that there's a harmonious relationship between the consumer and the provider of goods and services. So the provider is under an obligation to provide information as to the origin. Now, if you smuggle it, where you get it from? You can't have smuggled goods on your shelves. If you do what we know, when you talk about Barris the singer, if it appears on the shelf, where you get that from? These are the important questions that the Consumer Protection Officer can now ask and must get answers in order to protect those who are being provided with these products. So that is why it is important to say where it came from, the terms, etc., of the goods being sold. Thank you. Right. The vendor or service provider is also under an obligation to provide receipts and warrants. You know how many people sell stolen goods? Huh? You know how many people sell stolen watches and rings and chains? Huh? You know how many people do that? And we are saying that when there is reason for the Consumer Protection Officer to ask questions to ascertain the origin, they are expected to be given appropriate answers according to this piece of legislation that is here before us today. Madam Speaker, the bill also will prohibit vendors or service providers from committing a number of offenses, including misleading or deceptive conduct, misleading the public as to the nature of goods and the non-delivery of goods. This is important. You buy something, you don't purchase it. It's there to be delivered. 2 months after, the guy sold it again, maybe 3 times he don't sell it. These things must come to an end. Not everybody doing that, but those who do it. Just last week, a lady was telling me she paid for some things, and up to now we didn't receive. Well, the weather was bad, so I said, maybe it's the weather. I hope it's the weather. You understand? So these are practices that sound simple, everyday simple things, but the consumer must now know he can make noise. He can do something if he believes that he is not receiving what he expects to receive after completing the transaction on his end with the provider of the important service or the goods to be delivered. So the bill prohibits vendors or service providers from committing a number of offenses, including misleading or deceptive conduct, misleading the public as to the nature of goods, and the non-delivery of goods as well. Madam Speaker, the Board and the Consumer Affairs Department will be responsible for the administration of the bill. Currently, the Consumer Affairs Department is the only agency or consumer advocacy within the Federation, and it has endeavored to remain true to its mandate of ensuring that the rights of consumers are protected and appropriately defended. In this regard, consumers have consistently been educated, informed, and empowered to make more knowledgeable business decisions in the marketplace through the utilization of various outreach platforms, including radio and television interviews, town hall meetings, and the dissemination of information via the department Facebook page. We are determined to ensure that the consuming public is educated. You know how many people go and get a top-up? $20 top-up. After use for a few minutes, the money gone. No, seriously. But we don't know that this is a serious violation. This is happening almost every day. But I thought I had a top-up for $20. It's only $5 use you get of telecom time. That is robbery. I won't say highway robbery, because it's not highways, telephone robbery. But these are things that I am saying to the public you must become conscious of. Make sure the money that you are spending to get a service, that you receive it. Because this law we are passing today is insisting that you not only have the right, but we in the department, in the ministry, have the right to educate you on these matters, and we will continue to do so using all of the media outlets that are available to us. It is in keeping with the mandate of educating the masses that in 2023, the Consumer Education for Kids pilot program was launched. Where do you think it was launched? At St. Paul's Primary School. At Sadler's, you remember? Those of you who were paying attention. And also, eventually, that same afternoon, at the Dr. William Connor Primary School. And the objective was to bring the importance of consumer protection to the kids in their very early stage. That they understand.
There was a quiz.
There was also a quiz at Kunai. The evening, we had a quiz at Kunai. And who won? Irish Town won. That is
I remember.
yeah, Irish Town won. That is a fact. And it's in keeping with this mandate that we are bringing the learning, the knowledge, the information to the kids so that they can help their households in being protected from those who may be unscrupulous and are providing goods and services which are not in keeping with the contractual arrangement made by the consumer and the provider of the goods or services. Additionally, I want to make the point very quickly that a key objective of this program is to encourage students to share their own newfound knowledge with their family and friends. And since the launch of this particular pilot program, the Consumer Affairs Department has engaged in discussions with the Ministry of Education and its curriculum development unit in order to further discuss having this particular program become a fixture within the curriculum of all our primary schools. After having the proposed lesson plans vetted by the social studies curriculum coordinators within the Ministry of Education, I want to report that this new initiative has already been given the green light to be taught at the primary school level during social studies classes for the 2024 academic year. Apart from that, in educating the public, part of the mandate given to the Consumer Affairs Department involves conducting inspections at various businesses in order to safeguard the rights of consumers and to ensure compliance with consumer protection law relating to pricing, labeling, and, of course, food safety. The inspections are primarily focused on identifying expired goods, items in dented cans or damaged packaging, freezer-burnt items, and items lacking English labels. You're not supposed to buy anything unless you can read the language in which it is written. If you're not Chinese and you can't speak Chinese, then make sure you look for the English labeling on the goods. A lot of Spanish-speaking people are here, but it's not all of us who speak Spanish or read Spanish. So if you're bringing in the goods from Colombia or Argentina or wherever, make sure not only consumers, but those who are doing the orders, make sure that the goods you are bringing into the country for consumption by our people, that they are in the language that the people can understand. That is the language of English. Separate exercises are conducted. I'm going to come back to that because once we can attain the sustainable island state, we will become bilingual. I had the opportunity last week in the Bahamas. Had a bilateral with the Minister of Investment, etc., from the Dominican Republic. And that's one of the things we said. We want to make sure that they can speak English, and we want to make sure we can speak Spanish. So we've asked for some Spanish-speaking teachers to come here and help our kids at the primary school level. When I was going to high school those days, grammar school, you started Spanish only in third form. And Spanish was an alternative to biology. Well, I became a doctor, so I did the right thing. I went to do biology. But it deprived me of Spanish. So we want to make sure that we are bilingual here in St. Kitts and Nevis. We'll hear more about that. So I want to make the point that separate exercises are going to be conducted for the main purpose of collecting price data, which is essential in maintaining a detailed pricing database for all basket items sold at the 46 large and medium-sized supermarkets across St. Kitts and Nevis. We want to make sure that the consumer protection officers have access to all 46 major, large to medium supermarkets across St. Kitts. They are therefore going to come in and conduct the appropriate exercises to ensure that the bill and its specific objectives are being attained as a result of applying certain guidelines which are to be applied by the consumer protection officers in visiting the establishments. For the year to date, approximately 21,000 items have been removed from business shelves. Is that a lot? Maybe it should be 4 times that. But so far, the statistics that we have indicate that 21,000 items have been removed from business shelves in St. Kitts during these inspections which are carried out. This alarming statistic highlights a lack of compliance exhibited by many of our businesses. The department has been diligent in its efforts to educate and advise business owners about the importance of adhering to these laws. But it appears that without the proper ability to penalize, that's why we needed this legislation. It needed to be given teeth and power. because it needs the ability to penalize non-compliant businesses, and there continue to be a continuous blatant disregard for consumer protection practices simply because they know that these young ladies who visit them and the young men who visit them as protection officers, that they have no power as such to do anything except hoping that they, the business people, will comply with what they are asking. And so the passage of this bill would really better empower the Consumer Affairs Department to strictly enforce and uphold the outlined consumer protection framework contained in this bill. Additionally, Madam Speaker, the implementation of fines and penalties will serve as a crucial deterrent, ensuring that more businesses fall in line with consumer protection laws and prioritize consumer safety. We will ensure that all parties are appropriately educated. There can be no excuse that, well, we didn't know the law. You must know the law. We will help you to know the law. But if you are going to be selling services and goods to the public, before you start to sell, know the law. You have an obligation to know the law. I believe that not only, therefore, we must have the providers knowing the law, but those who are our officers protecting consumers must know the law. We will make changes. We will make sure that the department is not a dumping ground. We want to emphasize that. It will not be a dumping ground. It must have officers who can execute what the law says. We will train those who at the moment need to be trained. And those who are trainable will be trained. And what we need, therefore, are trainable officers so that they can understand what their roles and responsibilities are, so that they can effectively protect our consumers and give current and support and execution of this piece of legislation. For years, a lot of complaints about price gouging and so forth and so forth. This, of course, is going to help with that particular accusation. Because, as we understand it, to be frank, the prices of goods are moving almost with every shipment of goods that come in. It is not that we have unscrupulous, all of them, I don't think so, businessmen who want to have the whole hog and half of the next hog. Is that language parliamentary, Madam Speaker? I am sure it is understood by the ordinary man. So, Madam Speaker, in other words, when the price goes on a product that has been put on the shelves, we expect that the price has been determined as a result of the import cost genuine import cost, genuine import cost, and the markup, which is allowed by law, imposed, of course, set by the government. Anything out of that is price gouging, and we're going to come after them. Once the businessman is keeping within the law, this is the price of the good, the document, that is what I bought it for. This is what it cost me to transport it. This is what it cost me to ensure that it comes here. Once that has been put into the equation, together with your profit margin, the markup that the government says you're allowed. Of course, you could go below that because you're competing with your neighbor, next businessman next to you. But you can't go above what the government says is the markup. So the price of the goods, what you bought it for, we know that the price of the goods, it changes almost with every shipment because there's so much problems with disrupting supply chains. Things that used to take maybe 2 weeks or 2 months to come from China, it's taking 5 months, nearly a year. And the cost goes up. So the price gouging that we hear about, that is what really is not the only concern. It is you, the consumer. Look at some of the things that I have mentioned, making sure that the businessman is complying with what the law says, and the consumer protection officer doing his job properly to ensure that the consumer is protected. Madam Speaker, I believe that with the measures that will be instrumental in ensuring the continued integrity of the department's consumer protection efforts, and with the best practices of our law-compliant businessmen, and with the consumer public being highly educated and has a watchful eye and pays attention to what service or what goods he or she would be purchasing, I believe that with the continued integrity of the department's consumer protection efforts and the enhancement of the way in which business is conducted within the Federation, this piece of legislation, the Consumer Protection Bill of 2023, is going to be a landmark piece of legislation in St. Kitts and Nevis. May it please you, Madam Speaker.